It's with great pleasure that I welcome you to this important event to mark the centenary of the Government of Ireland Act. Queen's University Belfast is very pleased to host this event, which enjoys the support of both the UK and Irish governments. The anniversary of this profoundly significant event represents a key moment in the Decade of Centenaries. It provides an opportunity to reflect on the shared history of these islands. It also provides an opportunity to consider the progress made since the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. 2020 is also an important anniversary year for Queen's. It marks 175 years since the establishment of the Queen's Colleges in Belfast, Cork and Galway, and the beginning of our history as a university. University collaborations across the island have both endured and thrived over these years. Since 1845, our world-leading researchers, pioneering students and inspirational alumni have been making a real and tangible difference to society, not just in Ireland, but across the world. Today's event features contributions from a range of speakers, including academic scholars, historians, and political representatives. The aim of this opening event is to offer expert analysis from a variety of perspectives. This reflects an inclusive approach to marking this important anniversary. Discussions such as today's provides us with the opportunity to share our experience and our knowledge. This event is just part of a broader series of activities planned to mark the centenary of the Government of Ireland Act. More information on this will be shared later in the broadcast. The format of today's event will include a panel discussion. The panel involves Professor Feargal McGarry from Queen's University Belfast, Professor Mary Daly from University College Dublin, and the Lord Bute. We're also delighted to welcome the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Brandon Lewis, Secretary of State and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defence, Simon Covney, alongside the First and Deputy First Ministers of Northern Ireland, Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill. So this event begins important discussions, debates and activities for the year ahead. I know that you will find it both informative and enjoyable.
It's a great pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, the Right Honourable Brandon Lewis, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland.
It is a huge pleasure to be able to send you a message for this virtual event, marking the centenary of the passing of the Government of Ireland Act. This occasion is an important opportunity to reflect on the events leading up to the foundation of Northern Ireland 100 years ago, something we'll be commemorating across the United Kingdom next year. And I want to thank Queen's University Belfast for bringing us all together in this way today, and also to acknowledge the tremendous contribution that they have made to the education and prosperity of Northern Ireland, and indeed the rest of the United Kingdom. Queen's has recently marked its 175th anniversary, and it's rightly celebrated as an international centre of excellence in research and education at the heart of the community it serves. And during the recent fight against COVID, it's been at the forefront of global scientific research while supporting local communities across Northern Ireland. On behalf of the government and the people of Northern Ireland, I want to thank the team here for their dedication and their hard work during this surreal and testing time. Now, the upcoming anniversaries in both 2021 and 22 bring together a close to the Decade of Centenaries, a period in which many of us have had the opportunity to reflect on the past and to consider how events in the United Kingdom, Ireland and around the world have shaped the relationships across these islands. These centenaries mean different things to different people, but it is vitally important for all of us to engage in the debate about the past in an open-minded and respectful way. We must confront the difficult aspects of our history together and challenge the myths and the stereotypes that too often people have. Next year, we will commemorate the centenary of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland was formed during a particularly turbulent period for these islands, and it has faced many challenges in the last 100 years. yet it has survived a century of major geopolitical transformation in Europe and across the world, through a period which has witnessed the demise of the age of empires and the rise of globalisation. 100 years on, and Northern Ireland is firmly established and greatly valued as part of the United Kingdom. The Government of Ireland Act, which led to the foundation of Northern Ireland, was legislation that had a profound impact for the whole island of Ireland, and in particular the border communities and those minority communities on both sides of the border. And in particular, by establishing a parliament for Northern Ireland, the Act itself set out an important constitutional precedent for devolution within the United Kingdom. While the Act was repealed, of course, as part of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, that principle of devolution, with enhanced safeguards, is an important part of Northern Ireland's identity today, and a forerunner, indeed, for devolution across the United Kingdom. We remain unstintingly committed to the agreement, and we recognise the importance of the relationships that it delivers and ensures across these islands, both east-west and north-south. The mature relationship that exists between the United Kingdom and Ireland as sovereign and equal friends and partners is one that is vital to the success and the prosperity of Northern Ireland as a whole. And it reflects how the United Kingdom has changed, how it thinks of itself in the 21st century. This mature and forward-looking attitude is how we will approach the centenary of Northern Ireland next year. We have to look forward, look ahead to what is a bright and positive future. We have pledged to mark this centenary in an inclusive way, recognising our unstinting commitment to the Northern Ireland people and acknowledging Northern Ireland's contribution to our national life. And whilst I'll be saying much more about what we'll be doing next year before Christmas, as we look at events over the course of the last 100 years, the centenary presents an opportunity, one to explore new themes and uncover hidden voices from Northern Ireland's past. This is something that I hope the Shared History Fund will allow communities across Northern Ireland to do during our centenary year. That £1 million fund is being administered and distributed for the government by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And that fund will allow everyone across the United Kingdom to engage with the history of the centenary of Northern Ireland in creative and innovative ways. I want to encourage as many groups as possible. Everyone can play their part in encouraging people from a range of different perspectives to get involved in this important project, marking the centenary. Whether you're a small local community group or a larger institution, this is an exciting opportunity to explore our history, to learn from each other, and to discover untold stories. Back in August, the Prime Minister announced the establishment of a historical advisory panel. And I've been delighted to invite the distinguished Queen's historian and emeritus professor, Lord Bew, who is speaking today, to chair that panel. And I know that he, working alongside a diverse and respected group of historians, is looking to see a development of a programme that would explore the important historical context of the centenary, and also to encourage wider academic and public engagement with it. Now, whatever your view on history, whatever your thoughts, this is a moment where we can praise the people, the culture, and the traditions and enterprise of Northern Ireland. It's a place which has made such an enormous contribution to the United Kingdom and indeed the world. So this is an occasion to promote Northern Ireland as a place that's an attractive place to visit, a great place to invest, and an amazing place to do business. A place where our young people, like those who study here at Queen's, can choose to stay and use their talent to build that exciting future. As 2020 is drawing to a close, I know for many of us our focus remains on the challenges of COVID. And during the pandemic, people across Northern Ireland have shown phenomenal resilience and have come together in a remarkable spirit of innovation, unity and compassion. As we now look ahead, the centenary represents an opportunity, a chance to work together towards a more prosperous, exciting future for us all.
I'm delighted now to welcome our second speaker, Simon Covney TD, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Defence.
I welcome very much this opportunity to reflect, together with Brandon, Arlene and Michelle, and this panel of eminent historians, on the centenary of the Government of Ireland Act. History does not come with neat beginnings and endings, but the passage of this Act in 1920, through which the Westminster Parliament gave its approval and legal underpinning to partition and the foundation of Northern Ireland, is clearly a landmark moment in the history of this island and these islands. 2021 will, I know, see a range of different events to mark that centenary in different ways. And in light of the different perspectives that people will bring, I think that's a positive thing. Let us acknowledge our common history and deepen our shared understanding of it. Let us respect the diversity of our memories and perspectives, and let us use that deeper understanding and respect to strengthen further the relationships of the Good Friday Agreement. However, we have to acknowledge that this will not be simple or straightforward. The expert group that advises us as a government captured this well when they recalled the need to speak to the experience of three particular communities: the Unionist community, their identification with Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, and their pride in its existence and achievements; the Nationalist community in Northern Ireland, and the serious alienation they experienced over 50 years under the Parliament established in 1921; and the Southern Unionist tradition, whose way of life, culture and political aspirations were forever impacted by partition. So I want to recognise at the outset that for many, the centenary is an opportunity to reflect with pride on the existence and achievements of Northern Ireland and the people who live here. It is, for many, a story of resilience and achievement. But I also recognise that for the nationalist community, this is a story of disappointment and loss and tragedy, and a sustained and lived experience of discrimination and alienation for many years, and a recognition that for others, again particularly in the minority communities, in the southern border counties, the story is also one of being parted unwillingly from their kith and kin. And for many, including for me, reflecting on the centenary of the Government of Ireland Act is to reflect on separation and sundered relationships on this island, and also a sense of a missed opportunity in history. It was unfortunately an act which, in the words of UCC historian J.J. Lee, reflected British more than Irish political realities in 1920. Perhaps we can all reflect on whether another path could have been found, if only the creativity and imagination shown by political and civic leaders in London, Dublin and Belfast in 1998 had been demonstrated by their predecessors in 1920. We'll never know. However, we do know that, like all too much of our history, there was too much violence and loss. There was mistrust and misunderstanding, and too often a lack of generosity towards the other. Over the last century, in both our traditions, there were times that we set out principles and aspirations that were honourable and generous and inclusive. And there were times in both of our traditions when we fell far short of that, when we spoke of our politics and our desires for the future in terms of victory and defeat, or them versus us. And of course, at our lowest point, we experienced what Seamus Heaney described as the quarter century of life waste and spirit waste, of hardening attitudes and narrowing possibilities. That was the Troubles. It is important that we recognise those losses and each acknowledge our own failures. For our part, we are remembering a period between the census of 1911 and that of 1926, when the southern Protestant population declined significantly. There were undoubtedly complex political, social and economic factors to that, but they included feelings and instances of physical and economic insecurity in the new state. The next few years are an opportunity to deepen our public understanding of that part of our history. It is also important that we mark the successes and the achievements of people from all traditions during the last century of our shared history. And I believe our greatest achievements are the ones we share 22 years ago, when we came together and imagined a better way. The Good Friday Agreement was one of history's genuine new beginnings. It transformed the landscape of conflict, and it lit a beacon of hope and possibility that shone and still shines around the world today. Approved by the people of this island, north and south, the agreement is both an expression of self-determination and a firm basis for peace, progress and reconciliation in a way that the Government of Ireland Act could never be. As we have worked in the generation that followed the Good Friday Agreement to realise its full possibilities, it has been a shared endeavour and achievement of the Irish and British governments and the political representatives of all the people in Northern Ireland. In 2007, at the time of the St Andrews Agreement, that spirit of hope was captured by Ian Paisley when he said, "We have seen the first sign of a new light, and I hope that this light shines not just on those in this room, but on our children and grandchildren." The children and grandchildren of the Troubles generation and the Good Friday Agreement generation now hold that future in their hands. That is the spirit that informs the Shared Island initiative of the government, as the Taoiseach set out recently. This is our commitment to redouble our efforts to build connections and trust, to work together to face major strategic challenges, to develop our shared islands economy, to invest for the benefit of our border regions. It is a broad, positive, practical agenda, ambitiously resourced and firmly rooted in the Good Friday Agreement. The initiative is about the future, while today is about our history. But as we all know, it can be hard to separate the two. What we owe to rising generations is to consider our past in a way that is not about the rehearsal of old and bitter arguments, but nor should we forget our history. I was struck by a story told in Deirdre Nuttall's recent oral history of the Protestant community in the new state, which my department was proud to support. A man called Thomas from the border spoke of his uncle who was in the forces. Afterwards, he hid his ammunition by burying it underneath an apple tree. Gradually, the lead from the ammunition leached into the soil and killed the tree. Its steady decline was a constant reminder of the secret underneath it. The corresponding rifle stayed in the attic of the old family home until the 1990s. This is our history. This is our shared home place. We should have no secrets kept in the attic or buried in the earth. None of us should fear to speak, but more importantly, we should also show the courage to listen. I want to continue to hear the stories of those who struggled for Irish independence and of those who struggled against it for the Union and for the creation of Northern Ireland. There was pride in those struggles, no doubt, but also pain and regret and loss. I want to hear the stories of the toll of that conflict, the loss of life and homes and livelihoods. I want to hear the experiences of the minority communities on both sides of the border and the stories we don't hear enough in any of our traditions, above all the stories of women. I want to hear the stories of those who never felt their defining identity to be either nationalist or unionist, Protestant or Catholic, or even British and Irish, but who were an integral part in shaping our shared history. We should not be afraid of complexity or contradiction. It will be up to people like our historians gathered here today, such as Fergal, Mary and Paul, to draw out these themes and inform our discussions with research and analysis and understanding. Not an easy task. And as for political leaders, well, our task and our responsibility, as President Higgins said last week in the first of his centenary reflections, is to ensure a hospitality for all those narratives and to provide a comprehensive ethical framework within which memory, history and forgiveness can be accommodated. His initiative, launched in recent days and entitled Machnamh Céad or Machnamh 100, sets out to do just that, and I commend it highly. Just because we ourselves do not celebrate an event in history does not mean we cannot give the room and respect to others for whom it is important. Just because we do not share the experience of loss of another tradition does not mean we cannot give the space and sympathy for those who feel it. It is indeed incumbent on us to ensure a hospitality for all those narratives. We lose nothing, not our beliefs, nor our sense of identity, nor our narratives, by doing so. It is perhaps appropriate to take inspiration once more from the words of John Hume, as we've done so often in our search for a different path away from conflict and division. He said, "I have seen the friendship of Irish and British people transcend, even in times of misunderstanding and tensions, all narrower political differences. We are two neighbouring islands whose destiny is to live in friendship and amity with each other. I have seen determination for peace become a shared bond that has brought together people of all political persuasions in Northern Ireland and throughout the island of Ireland. If any of us reach the end of next year without having given a respectful hearing to a story or perspective from someone else's tradition, then I believe we have fallen short. Because the island we live in now is one that we have all, drawing on all of our stories, helped to imagine together. And it is together, as President Higgins reminded us, that we should strive to nurture memory and remembrance as a strong foundation of a shared, agreed future. Thank you very much.
Queen's University Belfast is delighted that we now have contributions from the First Minister of Northern Ireland, Arlene Foster MLA, and from the Deputy First Minister, Michelle O'Neill MLA.
The Government of Ireland Act was born of a unique blend of acceptance and denial. Between 1885 and 1921, parliamentary election results and political discourse demonstrated that Ireland was one island with two nations. The creation of two political institutions was acceptance of that. Throughout those years, there was an underlying transformation that reinforced the need to recognise this reality. The Irish nationalist tradition was slowly being undermined by a generational shift towards Irish republicanism, and Irish republicanism was deeply influenced by culturally and linguistically driven nationalist movements across Europe. They promoted a series of new cultural fronts that made clear that the definition of Irish was inextricably linked to Gaelicism and Roman Catholicism. However, the Act sought to deny two realities. It assumed, firstly, that Irish republicanism would be content with fulfilment of Irish nationalist demands, and secondly, that the two political institutions would come together in the long term. In reality, republicanism would not be sated by devolution, and the belief in the Union was the settled will of Northern Ireland. What resulted from those turbulent years was two secessions, not the two devolved parliaments within the UK of the Act, but the Free State seceding from the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland seceding from the Free State to remain in the United Kingdom. On the creation of Northern Ireland, we must reflect that it was a compromise. The Unionist campaign began as an All-Ireland one, and later it became about the prioritisation of Ulster, something which even the Irish Unionist Edward Carson implicitly accepted when he took the mantle of leading Ulster Unionism. The goal of preserving all of Ulster was compromised for 6 counties. The goal of no home rule was compromised for a parliament for Northern Ireland. These compromises were not reciprocated. Irish republicanism has never truly accepted them. The Irish governments vacillated from constructive engagement to obstructionism. As a political leader, when I look back at the decisions of my predecessors, I do not always agree, but I can understand. Each of us must lead according to our time. A knowledge, an appreciation and an understanding of history is vital, but we must not be prisoners of it. Irish nationalism and republicanism is wedded to historicism. Karl Popper details how impoverished a belief system it is, expecting events to deliver political outcomes. In my opinion, its attraction is that it disposes of the need to self-evaluate, engage with opponents, or to change. It imprisons its believers. 2021, Northern Ireland's centenary year, demonstrates the poverty of historicism. How many predictions of Northern Ireland's impending demise were made over those 100 years? Countless, but every prediction confounded. Unionism has never subscribed to historicism. This freedom is a strength. Every prediction is to plant a seed of doubt, but our response should be self-belief. Some ask, will the centenary year be a reflection, a commemoration, or a celebration? For me, it must be all of those and more. We must look forward to the new century ahead. We will celebrate the achievements and potential of Northern Ireland and its people. We will commemorate the challenges we faced. We must reflect on past decisions that shaped Northern Ireland, but all of this is to build our vision for the next generation. The Northern Ireland of 1921 was of its time. The Northern Ireland of the new century must be of ours. Our Northern Ireland is not one of two communities or of two ideologies. Many of us who lived through or were born in the years of terrorist violence had an urgency and an attachment to our politics and to our identities. Unsurprising when the mode of persuasion was violence. Over 2 decades of substantive peace, new generations have grown up in Northern Ireland free of threat with their own outlooks and identities. Unionism and nationalism doesn't mean as much or the same as it did before. Their political priorities are not constitutional debates, but focused on our political institutions working and delivering for Northern Ireland. For the past few months, I've been regularly meeting young people from across Northern Ireland to learn about and appreciate their aspirations to shape a vision for Northern Ireland beyond 2021. In 1921, the Northern Ireland Parliament was formed without the cooperation of Irish nationalism and the false expectation of similar institutions elsewhere in the United Kingdom. In 2021, there is a multi-party power-sharing executive of Unionists, Nationalists and neither. Cross-border bodies built on cooperation and sister-devolved institutions across the United Kingdom. In 1921, Northern Ireland was a force in the global economy in ships, rope and textiles. In 2021, we have built new industries of fintech, cybersecurity, film and television and advanced manufacturing, with a new national levelling up agenda and a national infrastructure we need with the Union Connectivity Fund. 2021 can be an opportunity to re-examine the past decisions that shaped Northern Ireland. Lord Londonderry's early proposals to create a common education system were not implemented. Is 2021 the time to restart that debate? My key reflection on our first century is our many successes were weakened by the lack of a common purpose. We did not harness the talents of all of our people for the common good. Beyond 2021, I believe the common purpose of the vast majority is to make Northern Ireland a success. In our new century, we can use the talents of all to build the common good of a happier, healthier, sustainable and prosperous place and people. By setting out our positive vision and our plan for the future, that's how we will shape unionism in the future. That is our common opportunity, and I want to build it together.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks to Queen's University Belfast for inviting me to contribute to today's event. A very warm welcome to all those who have joined us for these reflections on the Government of Ireland Act. During the course of this decade, from 2012 to 2022, we're marking the centenaries of seminal events which have shaped modern Irish history over the past century. These events have defined our relationship with Britain over the past 100 years. It's a relationship that's been characterised by colonialism, partition and political division, and one towards peace, reconciliation and renewed cooperation. 2020 has marked the anniversaries of much darker times. In 1920, the Black and Tans were introduced and the Lord Mayor of Cork, Thomas McCurtain, was murdered. And shortly after, Sinn Féin Lord Mayor Terence McSweeney died after 74 days on hunger strike. And in this month, 100 years ago, the Government of Ireland Act was enacted in Westminster Parliament, forcing partition on this island. The Government of Ireland Act came into force in May 21, 1921, and the British King George V convened the then Parliament in Belfast City Hall the following month, with James Craig becoming Prime Minister of the Northern State. Unionism will choose to mark these events in a way in which they see fit, and unsurprisingly, the British Government has proposed that it should be an occasion for celebration. Nationalism, however, will see it very differently. For Irish Republicans and Nationalists, there will be no celebration of the partition of our country. It has failed the people across this island. It's worth noting that the British monarch, during the visit to this island a number of years ago, acknowledged that with the benefit of historical hindsight, we can all see things which we would have wished had been done differently, or not at all. Irish nationalism and republicanism will present our political perspectives and experiences of partition. Discrimination and state repression were the lived experience for successive generations. Unionists have a separate narrative, and theirs was a lived experience which was different. The bottom line is that partition did not have an upside. It created an exclusionary orange state, the consequence of which was political conflict. However, these historical events and experiences will be placed in their contemporary context. The political, social and cultural consequences of what happened during the decade of 1912 to 22 continue to reverberate throughout this island to this day. And while we try to heal the wounds of the past, we must also live and strive in the present and look to the future together. The peace process and the Good Friday Agreement have created that alternative to conflict. The Good Friday Agreement has provided a peaceful, a democratic pathway to Irish unity, which I believe will become a reality during this decade. The constitutional future rests on the principle of consent, as set out in the Good Friday Agreement. Today's Assembly is unrecognisable from the previous iterations of the old Unionist regime at Stormont. Today the Executive is formed by and is representative of all of the people in the North. That is the difference to the failed regimes that went before. The once monolithic Unionist majority has gone, and the notion of a perpetual Unionist majority, the very basis of partition, has also gone. And like Brexit, there was and is no good partition, and that cannot be sugar-coated. So the objective reality that partition rests at the heart of many of our divisions here in the North and between Britain and Ireland cannot be ignored. Brexit has exposed the undemocratic nature and the failure of partition in Ireland, and it's created the biggest constitutional crisis for unionism in a century. The circumstances of Brexit have created a new political, social and economic uncertainty for Ireland and indeed for Britain. But significant new realities and opportunities have also emerged. The issue of Irish unity has taken on a whole new dynamic because of Brexit. Demographics are changing, and so too is the political landscape, and this cannot be ignored. I see no contradiction in declaring and delivering on our firm commitment to power sharing with unionism in the Stormont Assembly, whilst also initiating a mature and inclusive debate about new political arrangements which examine Ireland's future beyond Brexit. Similarly, I see no contradiction in unionism working the existing constitutional arrangements while taking its rightful place in the conversation about what a new Ireland would look like. We can do all this while maintaining our independent, distinct political identities and working in the best interest of all of the people. Today we're not only witnessing the realignment of Irish politics on this island, but we're also shaping it. We're entering a decade of opportunity where the freedom to choose our own future will be decided by the people on this island alone. How we live together, how we work together, and how we share this island together. This is a defining moment in the history of Ireland. And the decisions that all of the people on this island make now will shape the direction of our island for the next generation. Now we have a decision to make about how we engage with the history and the politics of next year. We can continue arguing over the past throughout 2021, or we can choose a different discourse by beginning a new, progressive conversation about how our divided traditions can share a future of opportunity on this island. To begin mapping out an agreed future together. Let me be clear, we don't want 2021 to be characterised by division and rancour. What we want is to have a political conversation that asks the questions, is there something better for each and every one of us on this island? As we approach the centenary of partition, I'm advocating one where Republicanism and Unionism and others contribute to a national conversation. Let's not refight the battles of the past. It's time to bring people together. We can open doors and we can let this future in. We must give people hope and our young people opportunity. None of us own this debate. It's time to hear all voices. A space is opened up for all citizens to have a conversation about the type of future they want. So there's an obligation on those of us who are making the case for Irish unity to offer a coherent and persuasive view of what the future would hold. A properly informed and facilitated debate about constitutional change is needed right across this island and between these islands. A new national dialogue has already begun about future constitutional change. The Irish Government should accept its responsibility to facilitate that discourse. A defining watershed is also opened up in respect to relationships in Ireland and between Ireland and Britain and the European Union. It's time to commence a planned transition to Irish reunification and to national reconciliation, which must be at the heart of all of this transformational process. I think it's fair to say that there are those of a British and Unionist identity who are starting to assess this. This is not to say that they are not British, nor have they given up their allegiances, but I believe they are being challenged to rethink their economic future. We will set out with confidence our analysis, our experience and our vision of an open, inclusive and agreed Ireland. The political momentum on change is moving in that direction. Citizens are looking to the future to see where their interests are going to be best served. Change is certainly in the air. It's imperative that we must promote reconciliation as opposed to deepening division. We have lived a century apart and partition has failed. We have lived for much too long back to back. It's time to start living side by side. It's certainly my conviction that Irish reunification and reconciliation are inseparable. I believe the current political discourse on constitutional change in Ireland must also address the challenge of building a reconciliation and a healing process. A new constitutional settlement in Ireland based upon a progressive national democracy would provide a durable framework guaranteeing civil and religious liberties and democratic rights for all of its citizens. A new agreed Ireland built upon the unity of all its people should put reconciliation and healing at the heart of both civil and political institutions. That is a society which embraces acknowledgement of the past but will make healing central to its future. A stark choice confronts us: a narrow, inward-looking vision of Brexit Britain or an open, inclusive vision of a new Ireland. 2021 should be about inclusive conversations. This is a time for big debate, big ideas and a public discourse that threatens no one. I want to look to the new future beyond partition, to the creation of a new Ireland built on equality, reconciliation and respect. As a political leader, as Deputy First Minister and as Joint Head of Government, I am committed to building a common cause with our Unionist colleagues and others for a shared society that makes room for and gives respect to every citizen. In April 2018, I attended an event in Queen's University marking the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. And seated beside me was a young man from Unionist tradition. And we got to talking about building peace in the future. This was a young man whose family had been directly impacted by the conflict, and what he told me has stayed with me. He said that he was open to the idea of a united Ireland, but that future had to be one that wasn't about victory. So let's look to a future that's not about victories, but a future that's filled with hope, with opportunity, and one in which we are all equal and feel a sense of belonging. Thank you.
The next part of today's event will feature a panel discussion between three distinguished historians, and I'm pleased now to introduce the chair of that panel, Professor Fergal McGarry of Queen's University Belfast.
Hello, thank you for joining us for this panel discussion hosted by Queen's University Belfast, marking the Centenary of the Government of Ireland Act. My name is Fergal McGarry. I'm Professor of Modern Irish History at Queen's, and I'll be joined in this discussion with two of Ireland's most distinguished historians, Lord Bew and Professor Mary Daly. On 23rd of December 1920, an Act to provide for the better government of Ireland was passed at Westminster. As we'll hear from our speakers, it was one of the most significant acts in modern Irish history. Along with the Anglo-Irish Treaty, whose centenary will mark this time next year, it shaped the settlement which brought the Irish Revolution to an end. The Act partitioned Ireland by establishing two parliaments, one in Dublin and one in Belfast. Although opposed by many north and south of the new border, the partitioning of Ireland did not come as a surprise. Since 1914, when the Irish Party leader John Redmond reluctantly accepted the need for compromise to secure an Irish Home Rule Parliament, some form of partition was likely. What was surprising about the proposals that emerged when politicians at Westminster reluctantly returned to the Irish question after the First World War, however, was the idea of creating a Northern Irish Parliament. Rather than simply excluding part of Ulster from Irish Home Rule, the British government resolved to grant Home Rule to Northern Ireland, an outcome few people would have anticipated prior to the war, when the slogan of Ulster Unionism was no Home Rule. So the Government of Ireland Act marks not just the partition of Ireland, but the establishment of a Northern Irish state. The legislation shaped the future not only of Ireland, but also the United Kingdom in ways that are remembered differently and with varying levels of awareness across these islands, and which continue to have important implications to this day. Commemoration is always political and it's always selective. We choose what to remember and what to forget. What we remember and what we choose and how we choose to remember it usually tells us more about the present and the futures we desire than about the past. Marking significant anniversaries, such as the Government of Ireland Act today, or King George V's visit to Belfast to open a new parliament, whose anniversary falls next June, can be misleading. Then, as now, these set pieces obscure the extent to which the remaking of Ireland was driven by revolutionary and violent forces. Between the summers of 1920 and 1922, some 500 people were killed as Belfast experienced the worst violence of the Irish Revolution. This violence, which impacted most on the Catholic minority, was distinguished by its sectarian and intercommunal character and a high proportion of civilian fatalities. Few of the terrible events which occurred during this period will be formally marked, but they will of course be remembered by communities and families in different ways. Consequently, this centenary presents many challenges, as will the centenary of the Irish Civil War, a term which could as easily be applied to the violence experienced in Ulster between 1920 and 1922. Many Unionists naturally look forward to commemorating the establishment of Northern Ireland next summer. But the price of preserving 6 Ulster counties for the Union was the severing of ties with Unionists in the 3 Ulster counties excluded from Northern Ireland and the rest of Southern Ireland. The border resulting from partition cut across communities regardless of their background, impacting on Protestant as well as Catholic institutions such as the Orange Order and the Protestant churches. For Northern Nationalists, partition entailed permanent minority status and was experienced by many as abandonment by the Southern state. As a result, we have 2 conflicting collective memories which emerged from these years. A Unionist popular memory of a state under siege from Republicans within and without, and the nationalist memory of alienation and of the traumatic violence remembered as the Belfast pogrom. And strikingly, the 2 new Irish states that emerged rooted their origins in blood sacrifices that took place in 1916 in the GPO and the Somme, rather than the less heroic violence that led to the formation of these states. And these narratives were as significant for who they excluded as who they included. In contrast, the Decade of Centenaries has seen a more inclusive remembering of events, such as the First World War and the Easter Rising, with civic society often to the fore in this process. Whether the difficult anniversaries that lie ahead can be remembered in the spirit of mutual respect, inclusiveness and reconciliation proposed in the New Decade, New Approach Agreement will depend on our willingness to consider more complex narratives than those which first emerged 100 years ago. So our first speaker today, joining us to reflect on the history and legacy of the Government of Ireland Act, is Professor Mary Daly, Emeritus Professor of History at University College Dublin. A member and former president of the Royal Irish Academy, Mary Daly is a member of the Taoiseach's Expert Advisory Group on Commemorations, which has framed the thinking around the Decade of Centenaries. Over the course of her distinguished career, Professor Daly has published widely on the social, economic and political history of modern Ireland. Her recent publications include The Cambridge Social History of Modern Ireland and 60s Ireland, Reshaping the Economy, State and Ireland. So over to you when you're ready, Professor Daly.
Thank you very much, Fergal. On Christmas Eve 1920, the day after the 1920 Government of Ireland Act became law, the Irish Times carried an editorial that quoted extensively from an editorial in the London Times. The Times highlighted the fact that while the Government of Ireland Bill was going through Westminster, it was treated with an indifference wholly out of keeping with its great and far-reaching importance. It claimed that the Act radically and irrevocably affects the constitution of these islands. This, I must conclude, was a very perceptive summary. The 1920 Government of Ireland Act is one of the most significant pieces of legislation in the history of 20th century Ireland, yet I suspect that few people are aware of its complete significance. Commemoration doesn't automatically imply celebration. A commemoration is arguably more valuable if it prompts reflection on the past and potential lessons for the present. So in that spirit, I want to reflect on the 1920 Act. Although it was repealed following the 1998 Good Friday Belfast Agreement, it continues to cast a long shadow over Ireland today. And I would argue that its long-term impact has actually been much greater than the 1920 Anglo-Irish Treaty. The seeds of the wider Anglo-Irish settlement can be found in the 1920 Government of Ireland Act. The Act also merits place in the wider history of UK constitutional settlements, a topic that has become more important in recent times with devolution in Scotland and Wales and independent referendums. The 1920 Act is also very much of its time. The Great War resulted in the collapse of three large multi-ethnic empires, the Habsburg, the Ottoman and Tsarist Russia. They were succeeded by many new states in Eastern and Southern Europe and in the Middle East. And the boundaries of those states were based on nationality. However, most of these settlements included minority populations of different religions or ethnicities. And there is little evidence, unfortunately, that boundaries drawn on this basis produced harmonious nations or a lessening of ethnic and religious tensions. The main purpose of the 1920 Government of Ireland Act was to resolve the Ulster question in a manner that met the wishes of most Ulster Unionists. It could and perhaps should be described as a Government of Ulster Act. It brought Home Rule to Ireland, to a six-county Northern Ireland, more than 30 years after Gladstone's first attempt to bring Home Rule to Ireland. And despite legislating for devolution, this was actually a very unionist, or more precisely, a very Ulster unionist piece of legislation, because the Act failed to meet the wishes of all others on the island, most especially the Southern Unionists. The words used to describe the 1920 Act in nationalist newspapers were dismissive, arguably dangerously so. The Irish Independent described it as a farcical situation, designed to establish two freak and fantastic parliaments. The Freeman's Journal called it a mere trick. The Home Rule Parliament of Southern Ireland, which had powers very similar to the 1912 Home Rule Bill, was universally dismissed by all as an irrelevancy, given Sinn Féin's landslide in 1918 and the party's commitment to a republic. By December 1920, the conflict between the IRA and the British forces had become extremely violent and bitter, with Kilmichael ambush and the retaliatory burning of Cork City. Large parts of the country were under martial law. The Dáil leadership and the IRA were concentrating on making the cost of British presence in Ireland too high to tolerate. The 1920 Act and its implications were never discussed at the infrequent meetings of Dáil Éireann. It wasn't even mentioned in the two sessions that were held in January 1921. Now, admittedly, it would have been very difficult for the Dáil to hold a serious debate on the topic of the Government of Ireland Act. The leadership was in constant danger of arrest, and they were facing more immediate issues, including talks of a truce and diverging attitudes among the membership towards peace talks. Yet the irony is that the 1920 Government of Ireland Act made the Parliament of Southern Ireland, which it proposed to establish, redundant from the beginning. Because once Ulster Unionism had been placated with the security of its own Home Rule Parliament, the way was open for Britain to contemplate granting the 26 counties some variation of Dominion status. King George V's speech at the opening of the Northern Parliament in the summer of 21 and his overtures in that speech to Dáil Éireann fits into that picture. The broad outlines of the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty emerge from the 1921 Act. And it is very regrettable that the Sinn Féin leadership didn't realise that and build it into their strategy for the treaty negotiations. Ulster Unionism and the British Authority wasted no time establishing a separate Northern Ireland government and administration. Consequently, breaking on Ulster, when a Northern Parliament and government already existed, was never a serious option for Sinn Féin during the treaty negotiations. And it was equally obvious that Britain was determined to retain some vestiges of authority over Ireland. The Irish campaign for self-determination was marked throughout by continuing tension between two goals that were not reconcilable. They could maximise independence, or they could secure a united Ireland, which would entail some continuing links with Britain. For most of the Dáil TDs, it is very evident that sovereignty consistently trumped unity, and that remained so in the later decades. Only about 10% of treaty debates, public and private, actually related to partition, and the members who spoke about partition tended to be either natives of Ulster or represented 3 Ulster counties. Most of the objections made to the treaty related to the residual ties with Westminster and the Crown, yet those ties disappeared over the next decade or so without any conflict. Northern Ireland was another matter. The 1920 Act provided for a Council of Ireland with equal representation from North and South. Historians have seen this as a mechanism devised by Britain to enable it to disengage from the Irish question, and if that was the intention, Britain failed dismally. However, the absence of an all-Ireland forum was a major loss. The two governments worked out ways to address matters of common interest, such as livestock disease or railways, and it would be naive to suggest that the Council of Ireland would have transformed North-South relations. Nevertheless, regular meetings of political leaders might have prompted greater mutual understanding. The historic O'Neill-Lemass meeting in 1965 was the first in over 40 years. If a Council of Ireland, however fragile, had existed during that period, it might have prevented successive Irish governments from viewing Northern Ireland issues as a matter to be resolved between Dublin and Westminster. In other words, they might have given some time and attention to Northern Ireland. At the moment, we are recalling the centenary of the Government of Ireland Act, and we're doing so at a time when the relationship between Ireland and Northern Ireland is facing challenges. It's unclear how Brexit will affect North-South relationships or Northern Ireland's relationship with Britain, especially given the apparent volatility of the relationships between Britain and Scotland, Wales at the present. One lesson from the 1920 Act is that politicians shouldn't, and I'm talking very much about Dáil Éireann at this stage, politicians shouldn't become so overly preoccupied with immediate issues that they fail to spot the long-term significance of other changes that are underway. I'm conscious that we're living in a 24/7 COVID world, which will hopefully pass, but the legacy of the 1920 Government of Ireland Act survives. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Daly, for that. Our second speaker, Lord Bew, is a crossbench peer and chair of the House of Lords Appointments Commission. A member of the Royal Irish Academy, he's Emeritus Professor of Politics at Queen's University Belfast and chairs the Northern Irish Centenary Historical Advisory Panel. Professor Bew is the author of numerous books on modern Irish and British history, including Ireland, The Politics of Enmity, and Ideology and the Irish Question, Ulster Unionism and Irish Nationalism, 1912 to 1916. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Fergal. Thank you. I want to open by making a remark about the context in which all of us who write Irish history in the 21st century are faced with, and that is two remarkable decisions made on this island in the last century, and they set the framework. They're both in their way retrospective validations, very particular Irish way of doing things. But the first is the 1918 Sinn Féin election victory, which was a decisive victory and which was a respective validation for the 1916 Rising, which when it happened most certainly did not have majority democratic support among Irish nationalists. And the second is the referendums on both parts of the island in 1998 after the Good Friday Agreement. Now, the first retrospective validation meant really an end to devolution as a form of settlement for the island of Ireland, the devolved Parliament in Dublin, something along the lines of what we've actually had in Scotland and the United Kingdom since the late 1990s, might be the basis, as John Redmond thought it would be. The debt owed to history was paid, the land question was solved, educational disadvantages of Irish Catholics have been removed. The final debt owed to history was the symbolism of a Dublin Parliament. That vision, that Redmondite vision, collapses in 1918 in the election, and it is a retrospective validation of the men of 1916, men and women of 1916. The other crucial development is that it is ultimately, of course, a final proof of the fact that the high unionist vision for Ireland is dead and gone. You can argue that it was dead and gone from, say, 1885, quite reasonably, but nonetheless, it is the destruction of the high unionist vision for Ireland in a more radical way than even the most pessimistic unionists would have expected. On the other hand, 1998 has a different meaning because it is an acceptance by the people of Ireland, North and South, on a large scale, that there is a type of democratic legitimacy attached to partition. And that is, of course, something that mainstream Irish Republicanism had not accepted throughout the 20th century. Indeed, mainstream Irish nationalism had not really accepted that. So it's a concession of democratic legitimacy of Northern Ireland as an entity. There are loads of other questions that neither referendum solved, either about social justice and so on, in either part of the island. But those big questions are resolved by those retrospective validations. And if you're writing Irish history in this 21st century, you have to respect those decisions and their implications, even if you may be uncomfortable in some way or other about them. But you had no point in writing it and thinking about history without taking into account those two absolutely major developments. Now, how do you put the Government of Ireland Act into that framework? What struck me when I started to look again at this Government of Ireland Act was when the second reading begins, Hamer Greenwood's speech. It's not like most pieces of legislation. Beginning of the second reading, the government gets up and says, "This is terrific. Just follow the lines in this thing. Everything will be better." In this occasion, he gets up and he's very melancholic. The speech is full of pathos. Greenwood is a Canadian. His basic worldview consisted of one proposition, at least, that the British Empire was hugely successful and hugely flexible and hugely adaptable. And he says at one point in the speeches, many races, old and new, have come to the conclusion that you can work within this framework. And what he's saying is, I have to come to the conclusion, however, that Ireland, one country closest to it, it's not worked that way at all. And that's how he begins, by talking about, and he says, well, why? And he uses a rather strange, he said, well, historians call this has happened for impalpable motives. I don't quite know if they're impalpable, what that translates as, but it's an indication again of the kind of anguish of and the somber tone to which he begins. And he presents the bill as the one way of preserving a united Ireland within the empire. And he lays great stress. Mary's talked about the Council of Ireland, I think quite correctly in everything that she says. He lays great stress on the Council of Ireland as a device to bring about a united Ireland within the empire. Two parliaments, and one of which will one of which in the north and one of which in Dublin. Now, there are problems here. One thing is that actually nobody really from Ireland, and it's quite made, supports this. I am not now. The Nationalists who remain in Westminster, the small number, don't support it, and the Unionists say we'll put up with it. We don't really want this. So it's a rather strange thing that it comes about as a function as much as British policy or British assessment of what you can do here and not do, that it comes about because of any passion on the Irish side, either unionist or nationalist. No unionist or nationalist actually speaks for it. Captain Craig does say that he thinks it means that there will not be Irish unity in his lifetime. And I read this and I thought of Lord Craigavon sitting in 1938, I think it is, G.C. Duggan says on the sofa at Stormont, and Lord Craigavon turning to Duggan and saying, well, it's a small place and, maybe there should be some coming together, maybe there will be some time. Obviously, 1938 is only 2 years before the outbreak of the Second World War, Irish neutrality, and then a few years later, the declaration of the Irish Republic, which would have put both Craig Avon's benign reflections on Irish unity into a darker place, but nonetheless interesting. That's just more or less at the end of a lifetime that he's sitting there speculating about the possibility of Irish unity evolving in the natural course of things over a period of time. But that's the crucial thing about it. The bill itself does not lead directly, in my view, to the truce or the treaty. But Mary is quite right. It is part of the key building blocks. It does, as it were, take the Northern Irish question and puts it in a safer place from the point of view of British policy. What I think has to happen to eventually get to the truce, first of all, and then the treaty, is the decision by James Craig to see De Valera in May 1921. And that, again, is something he can probably only do because of the Government of Ireland Act, which sufficiently strengthens the position of the leader of Ulster Unionism that he can take the huge risk, very unpopular among his own supporters, of going to see Eamon De Valera in May 1921. And that's a crucial moment, because once Craig has met De Valera, it's impossible to believe that somewhere along the road before too long, Michael Collins say is not going to meet Lord George. Its effect on the public imagination is so dramatic that it is a crucial moment in pushing forward the talks. And the interesting thing about this is that Craig acts as the instrument of the peace faction in Dublin Castle. Just at the time of the introduction of this bill, Dublin Castle, the British administration of Ireland, is transformed. And particularly John Anderson comes in, Mark Sturgis, and above all, Andy Coe. And there's also tougher military men brought in. And the approach is quite simple, a carrot and stick policy with Sinn Féin. Stick tougher military men, rough treatment, very rough treatment of the IRA. And on the other hand, the carrot is of people meeting them privately and saying, we could negotiate, we could talk. There are lots of advantages for the Irish side to negotiation. People in the Foreign Office in London were saying in 3 years, Ireland will be a republic in everything but name. And that, of course, was the key thing. Ireland could be a republic in everything but name, but it couldn't be called a republic because Britain couldn't live with that degree of humiliation. But that is the key thing. That's what the policy outlined. As indeed agreement says when he introduces the Government of Ireland Bill, there are two things not going to happen here. We're not going to coerce Northern Ireland, and we're not going to accept the declaration of an Irish Republic. But almost anything else, it's declared, is on. And the question is, what are the details of anything else, which is what the treaty talks are all about, and then the split within Irish republicanism. So what I want to say is there's a kind of zigzag between the Government of Ireland. It is related to what happened, but it required this further development, which is the establishment of a peace faction within Dublin Castle. And the remarkable thing is Sir James Craig making himself the instrument of that peace faction. And he does it because he thinks you can't just... The British do want to see, as they have firmly declared, unite Ireland within the Empire, and that might lead to moves at a later date, which we as Ulster Unionists don't want. For example, this happened to a degree in November 1920. And therefore, you're in a better position to deal with that if you've shown that you will do everything for peace yourself, that you will take the risk for peace. As he says, we cease to have an ideal before us, that we fight these people forever, and then say we want to be taught and live with them. And that he actually says in justification of the meeting with De Valera. So that's the zigzag, and I think that's very, very important in explaining. The Government of Ireland Act has its place in history, but it is also required, we want to add to it, the initiative taken by James Craig at the behest of the peace faction in Dublin Castle.
Great, thank you very much for that, Paul, and thank you, Mary, for your paper. Also, I mean, I'm struck by how both of your papers consider the treaty alongside the Government of Ireland, and you see the two as part of a whole, which is, of course, the outcome of the Irish Revolution, the settlement that determines really the broad sweep of Irish political constitutional history over the next century. So I want to start with that quite a big question, a counterfactual question. can we envisage any kind of alternatives other than what happened? Was partition the inevitable outcome of the irreconcilable demands of nationalists and unionists for self-determination, or were there other plausible scenarios that could have unfolded? So perhaps I'll address that question to you first, Paul.
Well, I've always been very interested in those groups, particularly with Nationalists, William Bryan's All for Ireland League, which would try to come up with formula which would allow partition to be averted by, for example, basically establishing a more or less a complete veto of the unionist community on the working of an Irish Parliament and so on. And these are very interesting ideas. I have to think that more interesting are Redmond's ideas, which accepted partition, but accepted it would be combined with direct rule. And direct rule, which would include Irish MPs staying at Westminster, would be direct rule administered in part by Irish nationalists, and therefore would be fairer to the Catholic minority in the North. So therefore, I think my short answer is some form of partition looks like it's inevitable from the Home Rule crisis of 1912 to 1914, but not this form as such. And this form, with Home Rule for the North, with greater violence in the North, is actually a function of the choice of 1916. You can defend 1916 in numerous other ways, but there isn't any question, which is why a lot of Northern nationalists and even Northern Republicans, if you look at their memoirs and reflections on this period, actually accept that point. So it's not so much this partition inevitable, although that's a reasonable question, it probably was, but this form of partition. And this form of partition was harsher on the Northern nationalists and Catholic community than other possible forms, and certainly the forms of partition that people at Westminster were thinking about in the years earlier.
Thanks, Paul. Mary, any thoughts on that question?
I wouldn't disagree. I think if you even go look the period from 1969 onwards into the 70s, when having given very little thought to Northern Ireland for decades, you find people in Dublin government officials looking at what kind of alternative government structures could be put in place. It's all in terms of something quasi-federalist, a huge degree of devolution. So whether you call it partition or whether you call it some form of devolution, much greater local autonomy, there is a divide. There is some form of division, yeah. And I mean, I agree with Paul that some form of partition was being tacitly acknowledged by most nationalists by about 1914 and certainly before 1916, but not in such a rigid fashion.
Thanks. I mean, one theme that comes across, I think, from both your papers is that, in a sense, there's a choice over sovereignty and unity, and the particular outcome that we get is where sovereignty or self-government is maximised both north and south. But that means, of course, that the type of partition and the intractability of that kind of partition settlement becomes very much entrenched, as opposed to the earlier, more flexible alternatives that before violence enters the equation. Shifting the emphasis somewhat, I'd like to just think briefly about the social impact of partition, because we're thinking about partition as well as the structures which are set up by the Government of Ireland Act. How was partition viewed by ordinary people, and how did it impact on everyday lives and everyday communities? And was that impact very sudden, or was it gradual? So I'll address that question to you, Mary.
Well, a lot of nationalists really put remarkably naive faith into the Boundary Commission, which we haven't actually neither of us mentioned, which was part of the 1921 treaty, that there would be effectively a rectification of the boundary. And there seems to have been you get, for example, local government officials based around Dundalk waiting for the deliberations about to not so much come and seize control of South Down and South Armagh as just be ready to re-engage with that area as part of the Irish Free State. A lot of nationalists and the Catholic clergy and various others were really working on the assumption that there would be a fairly serious either rectification of boundaries that would really reduce the number of nationalists that were in Northern Ireland, rather naively so. As we know, it didn't happen. There are various answers to it. You get, certainly in Southern Unionists, a certain number across the border. There's no doubt about that. You also get, but sometimes for different reasons, you get Ulster Nationalists, Northern Nationalists crossing the border as well. And I think the implications were slow in coming. Economically, it was really a gradual process, really the early 1930s, when Britain introduced the protectionist agriculture and Fianna Fáil introduced a very protectionist agricultural industry. That really ratchets up the social and economic consequences. But they've been coming for some time. For example, you couldn't get from one part of Fermanagh to the other in the 1920s without travelling into some of the adjoining counties in the Irish Free State. So you get a huge bridge building, road building system in Fermanagh to make Fermanagh a holistic county without having to straddle the border. It does change community relations. Parishes are cut by it. I think a lot of the impact was less than it would be now, because people used bicycles or walked, whereas there were only 16 approved crossing points for goods, and that would have affected motor cars. There are GPs who worked both sides of the border, ended up with a car on either side. There are all these kind of compromises. I grew up in Carrickmacross, which is a border town, but the road to Crossmaglen was sealed to vehicle traffic throughout most of my childhood, and we called the road the Dunamine Road. In other words, the town's only about 10, 12 miles away, but the local memory had obliterated the existence of Crossmaglen, and the road was called after a small parish with a church and a school and a post office and nothing else. So you find that, and you'd know older families there. There was an awful lot of intermarriage, interconnections of various kind. They gradually broke down. There were business connections of all kinds, and not just within the three Ulster counties that are part of the Irish Free State. Northern Roscommon, Sligo, Leitrim were, to my mind, part of Greater Ulster in economic terms. You can see it in terms of Northern banks, Ulster banks, and all kinds of business and trading relationships. So it does change the shape of Ireland and the focus of Ireland over time in various ways. And while you can't calculate this for northern counties, there is disproportionate population loss in bordering counties, which actually still applies to today. So I think the implications were quite serious, and it does change community relations in many complex ways. But then there are other community relations that do keep going. As I said, parishes, dioceses straddle the border. You get clergy, both Church of Ireland. I mean, I know from my own town, Church of Ireland and Catholic, who were appointed in either side of the border. So there was that kind of mingling and mixing that went on at local levels. But yes, it does change the kind of mental map that people had of their Ireland.
Right, great. Thank you for that, Mary. I'd like to move on now just to considering British policy, which both your papers focused on. And it seems to be one of the really key decisions we have to think about is the decision by the British government to create a devolved administration in Northern Ireland, which, going back to the period, you're struck by the fact that for a long period of the Ulster crisis, is something which Ulster Unionists hadn't demanded. It's sort of it emerges quite late in the day, I think, around 1919. Paul, what's behind that particular decision?
In fact, in very late 1919, Fergal, Carson makes a major speech saying, "We really do not want devolution of our own parliament." Very late in the day, late November. We always talk about the King's Speech, about the people who don't turn up, meaning the Catholic Church or the nationalist politicians on that side of the community. But there was another distinguished possible guest who didn't turn up for the King's Speech. It was what is in a sense the formal opening of Northern Irish Parliament, and that was Sir Edward Carson. So it's worth remembering. You're quite right. It is very late in the day. It seems to be a very rapid. It's not the logic of any. There's no logic in unionist thinking. If you look at the second Home Rule Bill, you might expect people to start popping up and saying, well, if they have a parliament in Dublin, what about giving us one here? Gladstone on the 5th of May 1893 makes certain concessions to the importance of parliamentary institutions being linked to local sentiment, which could have been used as a bridge for that sort of argument by unionists. And they don't try and push Gladstone along that road. So you're quite right, it's late in the day. And it is, above all, it would appear, a function of the change in Irish politics with the rising, with the Sinn Féin election, with the emergence of the IRA as a force. Once that starts to happen, there starts to be a very much stronger belief we need to get our own administration into our own hands. We need to make sure that it's not like Dublin Castle, which was famously penetrated by Michael Collins, that great line of Michael Collins about how easy it was to do that. But Jesus, how did these people ever come to run an empire? And the unionists looked at this and they said, we're not going to do that. We're going to have security forces under our own control. We're going to have a tighter system. This, of course, is very unfortunate, bears heavily on the Catholic minority in the North. But they felt that was the only way to go. It's sudden conjunctural thinking. The weakness in their thinking is that some of the people on the British side who want a local parliament also believe in using economic instruments to push the unionists to eventually come closer to the Dublin government. And that's always a threat, or to go along with whatever Lord George is trying to negotiate, say, in November 1921. But the threat never materializes to the cutting point. They always manage to see it off. And indeed, to come back to something that Mary was talking about, the economic implications of partition. One of the other remarkable things about the Government of Ireland Act is the one thing that never really operates is that Northern Ireland is never really funded as it's supposed to be funded. It's supposed to be independent, economically, essentially. And the boom city of 1880 to 1920, Asquith comes in 1916 and calls it a very superior type of Manchester, is his description of Belfast. That comes to an end, partly because of the troubles of the early 20s. And then as soon as you survive that, the shipyard and so on, that the heavy engineering, that whole world of industry goes into collapse internationally. And Belfast then goes on the dole, so to speak. It never operates as it was supposed to operate, as being a net benefit to the UK Treasury. It's a net loss. Devolution is quite important to make people stupid in this respect. And I don't want to wickedly suggest you can see, I wouldn't dream of suggesting you could see something similar in Scotland. But one of the problems that Terence O'Neill had when he was trying to say to unionists, we need to reform in the face of the civil rights movement. London wants reform. Is it well-educated middle-class unionists, he'd say in his memoirs, well, why? Why should London have any right to pressure us? And he would say, well, because they're subsidising us. And they didn't accept that. Just as many Scottish middle class today will not accept that they're subsidised by London. They simply didn't accept it. We don't need to change. Well, that's ridiculous, Terence. And it was one reason why he couldn't get the velocity behind his reform programme that he wanted. So there's a strange economic side to all this as well.
Great, thanks, Paul. It's one of the problems with the future. It never turns out as it's expected to.
No.
Which complicates our understanding of decision making then when we go back and look at it. Mary, staying on the topic of British policy, I think it's fair to say there's a consensus from historians now that British policy in Ireland was very poorly handled. But yet, if we go back to looking at 1921, 1922, there is a sense that Lloyd George is seen as the Welsh wizard. He's the person who's finally sort of solved the Irish question. And I'm struck also in the 1920s, certainly maybe later even, you have colonial administrators in other parts of the British Empire looking at partition in Ireland as something that worked quite well in resolving this very, very difficult conflict between different groups. Is there a case to be made for partition if, as both of you suggested, some kind of partition was always very likely? Is there a case to be made for partition that was done differently, that somehow addressed minority rights or the border or the relationship between the two Irelands in a more coherent way than turned out?
I think the big problem with drawing boundaries to try and create a homogeneous state is you'll never be able to get it 100% right. There will be minorities, and you are then effectively creating a politics that is very much based on religion or ethnicity, as opposed to a politics that might be based on class, economic interests, or other matters. So, I mean, this has been tried in many, many countries, and I think if you take a long view on it, it hasn't worked particularly well. I think if you were to go back to, I can understand the separation, and you can understand the emotional arguments behind it, and you can understand the feelings of security by groups behind it as well. But I think if it were to work, it needs some degree of more overarching body, some inbuilt minority protections. But on the other hand, I mean, if you look at what we have now in Northern Ireland with an effective assembly where there is people either identified as nationalist or unionist, this actually it breaks my, every time I think about that, I feel kind of uncomfortable with it, because it's effectively putting a kind of, it's putting politics into a fixed mould. Whereas if you look at the Northern Ireland census, what strikes me is the numbers who are no longer self-identifying in terms of religion or other badges. And I think the problem with partition is this badging that comes from it, and how you can somehow dilute the majority dominance and the minority sense of grievance. And, there may be some way around it, but it's complex.
Mary, you mentioned the issue of drawing boundaries. And of course, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that boundaries are being drawn all across Europe at this point. And I'm wondering to what extent we need to think more clearly about global shifts that are perhaps shaping developments in Ireland, because we always get very up close and start thinking about Fermanagh and Tyrone and the nitty gritty. Whereas I wonder to what extent is what's happening in Ireland, it's part of a global redrawing of boundaries as political shifts, and even the concept of how political power operates is beginning to change everywhere. I mean, to what extent is Ireland, Northern Ireland in particular, kind of a case study of those wider forces?
Oh, I would have thought yes it is, because as I said briefly in my presentation, the fashion at the time, and I don't want to be dismissive about it in any way, but you're moving from an era where a king or an emperor could assemble properties through marriage, through whatever long historical wars, and bundle them together into a multi-ethnic, multinational entity. And you're moving to something that is more democratic. And once you move to something that is more democratic, you have to take account of the wishes of the people. And this is happening against a background of nationalism and a nationalist identity. So what's happening in Ireland is very much part of the kind of post-war realignment of a lot of Europe, peripheral Europe particularly, and into the former Ottoman Empire as well. And I think we have to think of it in those terms. And in many ways, if you do think of it in those terms, it worked better than it worked in many other places. And I think we then have to acknowledge that. I think we often find the bleaker sides of Irish history and Irish achievements or non-achievements. So it is a gloss we need to put on the story. And I think it also takes it away from becoming too introverted about the Irish question, to begin to see that we're not alone in having to face that. You've got the Sudeten Germans. You've got, you take the Balkans. Where do you begin? You've got a whole complex mosaic, and out of it you do get something to the effect that really. I've come to the point. I hope I'm not becoming a very old fogey. That think somewhere like the final days of the Habsburg and the Ottoman Empire were not as bad as they were perceived. These were multi-ethnic, multinational entities where people of different religions and ethnicities appear to have been able to coexist relatively amicably. And you need to see what lessons you can learn from that, while, of course, respecting democracy.
It's interesting to be talking about that this week, because some people would say, in a sense, the EU is going full circle to that 19th century world of flexible political structures. I think you're right. I mean, we naturally think about violence, and rightly so, but we also should think about the scale of violence. And what happens in Ireland is obviously very different to what's happening in other parts of Europe at exactly this time.
The War of Independence, a very quiet day over there on the kind of boundaries of the former Tsarist Russia and such like, at around the same period.
So I'd like to begin to draw things to a close by thinking a little bit about how we remember this particular event, but also kind of how we remember that we've a couple of years of very difficult events coming up. I think it's fair to say that the Decade of Centenaries, it's not without its hiccups and issues, but it's been very successful in terms of public engagement with the history of 100 years ago. I think it's been very successful in terms of the emergence of more inclusive forms of memory, more generous narratives, a willingness to reconsider some of the old stories that have been so entrenched. And I think you see that particularly with how we visited the legacy of the First World War, and also to extent the Easter Rising, even though it's a more difficult event. But I think it's fair to say that the issues we are commemorating now with partition and also with civil war are of a different order. Is it realistic to think that we can find ways of remembering those events which can respect the opposing perspectives on the period that exist? Is it possible that we'll have a sort of a complicating of the narrative when it comes to partition and the formation of Northern Ireland? So I'll address that question firstly to Paul.
Right. Thank you, Fergal. Let me say, just to do what Mary did for him, which is to step outside Ireland. This is always difficult anywhere. As it happens, I was the co-chair of Parliament's commemorations for Magna Carta and the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, with Tristan Hunt restoring them when he left Parliament, Kwasi Kwarteng, also a historian, Conservative MP. And that was bitter enough at times, sharp enough, because people said, we don't want roast beef in Old England. We don't want some happy story of 800 years of liberty and the rule of law. British history has been far more conflict-ridden, there are far more losers, and so on. And so even something like that, which people would think is, to use Parnell's phrase, an old gentleman for a tea party, wasn't a tea party particularly. So this is difficult. There's no question, the whole question of Northern Ireland and its establishment. My own view is that, first of all, already the way matters have been held and carried on in the Republic shows the value of having professional historians, shows the value of having people have a commitment above all to historical objectivity insofar as they can attain it. And that's already something we can learn from. And I personally, as chair of the committee here now in Belfast, had a very useful conversation with Maurice Manning, trying to pick up on the lessons of his experience. And my own view, just to give this particular reassurance, with committee I have is a very diverse group. But it's certainly, and I'm speaking slightly personally now, when I say one of the things that I'm convinced of is there's absolutely no question of trying to brush the difficult aspects and the dark aspects of the foundation of Northern Ireland under the carpet, and the violent circumstances of 1920-22. It would be ridiculous to try and do it. And more profoundly and positively, I do think there is a need to have more understanding and respect, and this for Joe Devlin, the leader of Northern Nationalism at this time, for a whole number of reasons. By no means all of it unionist reasons, because Devlin was a controversial figure within nationalism and had many, many nationalist critics. But for a whole number of reasons, the complexity of his career and his commitment to labour in Belfast and so on has not fully come out. He is the big loser in one way in 1921, but nonetheless it is tremendously important, and there's an enormous amount to be learnt from Devlin's career. And one of the things I'd see as an achievement for the commemorations, which we're now attempting to do, and the Historical Committee advising on that, would be to lead to more respect within Northern Ireland for the role of Joe Devlin. I'd be very happy if that turned out to be the case.
Thanks, Paul. Mary, same question to you. Do you feel hopeful that we can navigate our way through these difficult anniversaries?
Well, I think we have a series of difficult events to navigate coming up over the next couple of years. In terms of partition, I think one way that we can approach it is to move it from, if you call it the national level, down to the more local and the more personal level. I think looking particularly at border communities, looking at Southern Unionists and Northern Nationalists, and beginning to disentangle some of those stories. A commemoration doesn't have to be all about the winners. I mean, you're always told history is about winners, but I think there's been a shift in more recent times to looking at losers as well, or maybe drop winners and losers terminology and begin to look at quite how it did play out among Monaghan Unionists, among South Armagh Nationalists, and how it impacted on places like Donegal, for example, Inishowen and Derry. Looking at the Lagan, the Protestant area of Donegal, I think if you move it into the more local, you will hit some really rough local stories as well there, which people may have forgotten. But it is a way of taking it down to the more intelligible level for a lot of people. It's humanizing the story, and it's kind of bringing it home to them in a way that they might understand it better.
Right, yeah, I mean, I think once you start looking at the local, and particularly when you start looking at the individual, it immediately sort of complicates narratives, and the big political narratives that we have immediately begin to sort of fall apart. We see that they're kind of almost retrospective constructs in many senses. I'd like to thank you both, Lord Bew and Professor Daly, for taking your time out to join us today to reflect on this important engagement. So on behalf of Queen's University, thanks very much for contributing to this discussion, and hopefully we'll see you again to talk about some of the other anniversaries approaching in the future. Thank you.
We hope that you've enjoyed these reflections on the centenary of the 1920 Government of Ireland Act. Queen's University is keen that inclusive dialogue and debate should continue during the important 100th anniversary of the Partition of Ireland and the establishment of Northern Ireland. In 2021, we'll therefore be organising and hosting a series of reflections on diverse aspects of that centenary, and we look forward very much to your joining us for those.